In the heart of the Dust Bowl, when hope was as scarce as the rain, a father's quiet preparation would become the difference between survival and ruin. With nothing but the earth to trust, Thomas Garrett's secret root cellar became his family's lifeline. Before we dive into this story of grit and perseverance, let us know where you're watching from, and if survival tales inspire you, hit subscribe, because tomorrow's story might just teach you how to weather the storm. It was the summer of 1933 when Thomas Garrett first noticed the signs. His wheat, once strong and hardy, had begun to wither in the unforgiving heat of the Great Plains. The land he had worked for the better part of a decade, the soil that had once been generous, was now a patchwork of dust and cracked earth. The crops were failing, and the banks that had been his allies in better times were now coldly indifferent. But Thomas wasn't one to panic. He had learned early in life that survival wasn't just about planting crops. It was about what you did when those crops failed. For years, he had spent long hours in his fields, sowing, reaping, and battling the elements. But the thought of his children, young Mary, Elsie, and little Samuel, being left to face the endless winter with empty stomachs gnawed at his soul. As autumn approached, bringing with it the first whispers of colder winds, Thomas set to work in secret. He wasn't sure how long it would take, but he knew that no matter what, the family would have food to see them through. The neighbors had no such luck. The townsfolk who had ignored his warnings about conserving, about planning for a hard winter, were already watching their stores run low. They had laughed at Thomas's obsession with preparation, but when the frost came, they wouldn't be laughing anymore. In the dim light of the late afternoon, as the sun began to dip behind the dry hills, Thomas dug. The hole grew deeper each day, the earth grumbling beneath his shovel, as though it too recognized the weight of what was to come. Soon enough, the cellar was finished, tucked below the frozen earth, just as he had imagined it would be. There, in that cool, dark chamber, Thomas would store what few crops he had left: apples, potatoes, carrots, enough to feed his family through the brutal months ahead. But the storm was coming. And it wasn't just the winter he feared, it was the weight of everything he had tried to control, knowing that in the end he was only a man standing against forces far beyond him. With the cellar ready, the only thing left was to wait for the world to change or break. The first frost hit in early November, coating the land in a thin layer of ice that sparkled like broken glass. It was a cruel sight, the promise of winter, with none of the warmth it was supposed to bring. By now, the town was a ghost of its former self. People had sold their last few cows or emptied their barns to raise what little cash they could. The stores, once full, were barren, their shelves stripped bare. Mary and Elsie had begun to cry at night, their hunger growing more pronounced with every passing hour. Little Samuel, too young to understand the looming disaster, had taken to asking why the sun had disappeared behind clouds for so long. The questions burned Thomas, but it was in his nature to hide his fear, to mask it in silence and hard work. Each day he made trips to the cellar, storing what he could, checking the supplies, making sure the potatoes were stacked just right to prevent them from rotting in the dark. It was a rhythm that kept him grounded, kept him from thinking too much about the neighbors who had laughed and the distant memories of what used to be. There was something about the dust that made everything feel more permanent. The wind had been howling for weeks, a constant reminder that the world was in a state of collapse. The barn, once sturdy and secure, now seemed fragile, ready to collapse at any moment. The same went for their house, creaking with each gust of wind, its walls beginning to show signs of strain. Thomas knew it was only a matter of time before the storm that had already consumed so many parts of the country would hit them. The children, though confused, had begun to understand in their own way. Mary had started sneaking down to the root cellar at night, taking a few potatoes to ease the hunger pangs that Thomas could no longer ignore. But he let her. They all needed to understand that the survival of the family would rest on small acts of courage and sacrifice. One morning, as the wind howled louder than ever before, Thomas stepped outside to check the weather. He could feel it in the air, a heaviness, a foreboding that the winter would not be kind. The crops were gone, the earth was exhausted. And yet, somewhere beneath the surface of it all, there was a flicker of hope hidden deep in the cellar he had dug with his own hands, the thing that might keep them all alive. By late December, the air was thick with the scent of snow, the kind of storm that swept in quickly and didn't relent. The cold had been gnawing at the family's bones for weeks, But this blizzard was different. This storm came with a vengeance, slamming against the cabin like a battering ram. Thomas could hear at first the low rumble in the distance, the wind shifting its direction, gathering strength like a predator stalking its prey. It had been weeks since the first frost, and now the snow had come, turning the land into a vast, endless white desert. Inside, the fire sputtered weakly in the stone hearth. It was all they had to hold the cold at bay. The cabin, despite its thick walls, wasn't built to survive a blizzard like this. The air seemed to freeze as the storm raged on, howling and scraping against the structure, looking for cracks, weaknesses. It was a battle, and Thomas knew that this storm, this first taste of winter, would not be the last. The children huddled near the fire, wrapped in blankets that barely kept the chill at bay. Elsie's small hands trembled as she clutched her little sister Mary close. Samuel had fallen asleep in his mother's lap, his face pressed against her chest, unaware of the danger that loomed. Thomas watched them closely, his eyes flicking between the family and the small, meager fire. He had always been prepared for something like this, but no amount of preparation could stop the biting cold from creeping into their bones. The root cellar, however, remained untouched. He had done what he could to make sure the supplies would last. Inside that dark, cool space were sacks of potatoes, onions, carrots enough to feed them for months if they managed to get through the winter. But now, as the storm raged outside, the cellar was more than just a place to store food. It was their lifeline. But even that wasn't a guarantee. The storm had already started to drift over the cabin, packing snow against the door, blocking their escape. The windows, small and fragile, trembled under the weight of the wind. "We have to keep the fire going," Thomas said quietly to his wife Ruth. She nodded silently, but Thomas could see the same concern in her eyes that gnawed at him. How long could they last like this? How many more storms would come? The situation seemed more dire every day, but still, he held onto that quiet hope, the hope that the root cellar, the one thing he had prepared carefully and quietly for, would save them all. By February, the worst of the storms had passed, but the damage had been done. The ground, once fertile and full of promise, was now a barren stretch of cracked earth. The winds had torn through the plains, stripping away any trace of life. The crops that had once given Thomas hope were long gone. There was no more wheat, no more oats, and even the few apple trees he had planted had barely survived the harsh conditions. The family was living on what little they had left. The food from the root cellar, which had seemed so abundant in the fall, was now slowly dwindling, disappearing one bag of potatoes, one carrot, one jar of pickled beans at a time. The strain was beginning to show on Ruth's face. Her once bright eyes had dulled, and her movements had become slower, weighed down by the endless worry that gnawed at her. Elsie had stopped crying at night, but her silence was even worse. Mary, too, had started to grow pale, her face hollow from the hunger that had begun to settle in like an old friend. Samuel, though still too young to understand, was beginning to show the same signs. Thomas, too, had started to feel it. The cold, the hunger, the constant battle against the elements, they were wearing him down, piece by piece. But there was something else, something deeper. The weight of it all, the guilt. Had he prepared enough? Could they make it until the spring? And what if the root cellar wasn't enough to feed them? It was on one such evening, as Thomas lay in bed beside Ruth, that he finally spoke his fears aloud. "I've done all I can," he said quietly, the words almost foreign on his tongue. "But sometimes, I wonder if it will be enough." Ruth didn't answer at first. She only turned toward him, her hand resting gently on his chest. "We've always made it through," she said softly, her voice steady. "We'll make it through this too. We have to." Her words, though comforting, didn't quell the fear inside Thomas. They were living in a world that seemed to be falling apart around them. The world they had known, the one filled with possibilities, had given way to one of survival, where hope was in short supply and every day was a challenge. But in that moment, as the cold wind continued to howl outside and the storm passed over them once again, Thomas made a vow. He wouldn't give up. He wouldn't let his children starve. The root cellar was his creation, a symbol of his strength and foresight. He had prepared, and he would keep preparing. This winter was only a test, and he was determined to pass. Spring came slowly to the Dust Bowl, like the first hesitant breath of someone waking from a long, fitful sleep. The winds had softened, no longer howling across the plains with the same ferocity they had in the dark months. The snow had melted into the earth, leaving behind a stark, empty landscape that seemed to hold its breath, waiting for life to return. Thomas stood in the doorway of his cabin, staring out at the fields that had once been filled with hope and the promise of a good harvest. Now, the land was barren, cracked, and worn down by the weight of the storms and the relentless drought. He could see the remnants of the crops he'd planted the previous year, what little had survived. The soil had been drained, the dust hung thick in the air like a veil, and there was no sign of anything growing, not yet. But something was different now. Something had changed inside him. The winter, long and brutal, had taken its toll, but it hadn't broken him. The root cellar, the one place he had trusted with his family's survival, had carried them through the worst of it. He had watched as his children's faces had slowly regained their color, their strength returning in small increments with every passing day. Elsie and Mary had begun to laugh again, their voices carrying through the house like music. Even Samuel, too young to fully comprehend, was starting to run and play outside, his small feet kicking up dust as he raced through the field, chasing the wind with wild abandon. Ruth, too, had found her strength. She had been the silent pillar of the household, the quiet engine that kept everything moving. Together, they had weathered the storm, as a family, as a unit, and now, with the first warm breezes of spring, they could begin to rebuild. But Thomas wasn't the same man who had first dug the root cellar in secret. That man had been filled with doubt and fear, unsure whether his efforts would amount to anything. The man standing in the doorway now was older, perhaps, but resolute in a way he hadn't been before. He had learned the hard way that survival wasn't just about strength, it was about foresight, about preparing for what you could not predict, about planting seeds of hope even when the land seemed too barren to support them. The root cellar, which had once been nothing more than a quiet, dark corner of his land, had become a symbol of that hope. Inside, the sacks of potatoes and carrots that had seen them through the winter were almost gone now. But the lessons they had learned from that survival, lessons of resourcefulness, patience, and quiet determination remained. The pantry was still stocked with jars of canned goods, the fruits of hard work and careful preservation. The winter had been harsh, but it had also solidified Thomas's belief that, no matter the odds, a man could survive if he understood the land, if he trusted in what he could build. As the days stretched longer and the warmth began to take root, Thomas found himself turning back to the land, to the soil that had once failed him. He knew it wouldn't be an easy road, the drought would continue to haunt them, and the land would take time to recover. But that's all they had: time, patience, and the will to endure. He glanced down at the ground beneath his feet, the dry earth, cracked and thirsty. But in that soil, somewhere deep down, there was still potential. Maybe it wouldn't yield the bounty they had once dreamed of, but it could still grow. That was the lesson the root cellar had taught him, that survival wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about an easy harvest or a gentle winter. It was about seeing the possibility in the most difficult places, about knowing that sometimes the greatest reward came from the hardest work. Turning back to the cabin, he watched as his children, now fuller and stronger, played in the yard. Ruth was outside too, gathering what remained of the winter herbs from the small garden she had tended through the cold months. They were alive. They had survived. And in surviving, they had become something more, a family shaped by the land, by their hardships, and by the quiet certainty that no matter how hard the wind blew, they would stand strong. The world outside might be uncertain, but inside this small cabin, amid the cracks and dust, there was a future. It was fragile, yes, but it was theirs to nurture. And as long as they had each other, as long as they had their hands in the earth and the warmth of the sun on their backs, they would rebuild one slow, steady step at a time. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the prairie, Thomas stood there a little longer, taking it all in. The winter had tested him. The storms had nearly broken him, but they hadn't. He had passed the test. And in doing so, he had made sure that his children, his family, would know how to survive whatever came next. And that, Thomas Garrett knew, was the greatest gift he could give them.